My name is Aaron Edwards with Santos Springs. Welcome to this week's edition of the Friday Field Report, South America. We're going to start talking about weather, geography, and we're going to wrap up by talking about Brazil's soybean planting pace. So let's jump in. We got a lot to go over. I'll go ahead and share my screen here to look over some of these images. So the first one that I want to point out is kind of the southern tip of South America. I'll mark this up. We're going to do a side-by-side of the 14-day kind of past precipitation compared to normal. We'll start with the southern part of South America. Let me get a marker here. Let's do green. There we go. So this is a breakdown of Argentina. And then over here we've got Paraguay, and then this is southern Brazil. We'll do a little bit of color coordination. We'll do green for Brazil. These are some states we're going to be highlighting. This kind of region of Brazil we're going to be highlighting and talking about later. And then let's do red for Paraguay. That's this Paraguay. And then we'll do the blue for Argentina. It's over here. All right. So just to put some numbers to it, Brazil is rounded numbers, right? Brazil produces probably more than 3 times as much soybeans as Argentina, depending on which numbers you go with what estimates. But we're probably talking about a Brazil soybean crop upwards of 170 million metric tons. Argentina is probably going to come in close to 50. So Brazil produces 3 times more soybeans. Now, if you add Brazil and then Paraguay's at about 10 million metric tons in Argentina. So southern Brazil, Paraguay, and Argentina, roughly these regions I'm showing you is roughly half of South America's production. And then that brings us to the next image that I want to share, which is also the 14-day past precipitation, kind of how have the last 2 weeks of rain been compared to the previous ones. And here we really zero in on Brazil, but I'm going to kind of draw, here's Paraguay. So we're looking at this southern tip. If we draw an arbitrary line, this is way oversimplification, but we draw an arbitrary line right about through here. And this is roughly 50% of South America's production. And under here, southern Brazil, Paraguay, Argentina, that's roughly 50% of South America's production. The reason I wanted to highlight that, and this is real big picture, right? But there's 2 things that are interesting to observe, or really one thing, but it's important. There's kind of a similar weather pattern that goes on in central and northern Brazil, and then there's kind of an alternative weather pattern that affects southern Brazil and Argentina and Paraguay. And tracking those weather patterns can be, where in the U.S. you kind of have the same weather pattern going through the Midwest or much of the Midwest, so weather is kind of the same. You kind of have 2 stories. How's the northern part of the production region, which is Mato Grosso, those northeast expansion states, the Cerrado in Brazil. And then you have another story, which is, southern Brazil, Rio Grande do Sul, maybe parts of Paraná, Paraguay, Argentina, and that's another story. And it kind of works out, depending on where you draw the line, it kind of works out that that's roughly half of the soybean production. And putting it into numbers, all of South America produces, it depends on the estimates, but close to 2 times as many soybeans as the USA. So if we think about it, each one of those, if you kind of split the Americas into thirds, the USA is 1/3 of soybean, that northern and northeastern Brazil, Cerrado and northeastern Brazil is roughly 1/3, and then Paraguay, Argentina, southern Brazil is roughly 1/3 of soybean production. And I just kind of wanted to make that clear because as we talk about planting and planting progress, that nuance makes a difference. This next image here is the expected rain over the next 7 days. So basically next week's rain. It's scattered when it's going to rain, but if you look a week into the future, basically there is rain from north to south in Brazil. Spots of Argentina maybe are a little bit iffy, but it's just widespread rain. So we're going to talk a little bit about planting progress and what to expect, but it's important to know it has been dry. Rain is expected. We're at that critical week where farmers are either saying, should I plant in the dust because there's rain forecasted? Should I wait for this rain? And then once I get adequate moisture, make sure I get a good crop on the other side of it. And in Brazil, where you have that double crop corn as a major factor, the cutoff of that decision is basically, I want to make sure I get enough acres planted to give myself the double crop corn acres that I need. But if I'm not going to do double crop, I'll probably just wait on the rain. So that's kind of the cutoff. A good rounded number is 30% planted by the end of October to make sure that you're in the window for double crop corn. Now that varies region by region. There's a lot of nuance to that, but just looking at big picture numbers, that gives us a good idea. I also want to take the opportunity to just talk a little bit about geography. So we're going to go back to that Argentina map, and this is as much to just kind of point out some interesting factors. Let me get a marker here, zoom in on this. So Argentina kind of played a little bit of, they skipped in line and they exported. They typically export about, we'll get something that shows up better. They typically export 4 million metric tons of soybeans, and they're big exporters on meal. Because of the reduced tariff on soybean exports, and it was till the end of October or 7 billion. They hit that 7 billion target, I think, in 3 days. They have actually already exported or made commitments. They've actually already exported or made commitments on 12.5 million metric tons. So one way to think about that is they jumped in line and took rounded numbers, 8 million metric tons, 8.5 million metric tons from the US. Another way to look at it is they now very likely will have to import some of that volume because they also exported a lot of meal. So there is the possibility that there will be fairly significant imports, and then where will that grain come from? The main candidate is Paraguay. Paraguay is kind of the low-hanging fruit as far as the first people to ship into Argentina. So Paraguay grain likely will move south to Argentina, be crushed and exported as meal, at least a lot of it. That's not abnormal. What might be abnormal is the volume, how much. So that's one thing I'm watching. And even parts of this, southern Rio Grande do Sul, western Paraná, a lot of this, I could even draw that a little bit better. It's a little bit bigger area. This part here is an interesting, let me make that in green just so we can look at it a little bit differently. Okay, this green loop, that's a region in Brazil that has the potential to also export to Argentina where it makes sense logistically. And I think that that's also a possibility, which this is just a little bit of geography for us to think about the flow of grain. I think we're going to see those numbers be bigger. We haven't really seen basis pick up in those regions. So it's not a for sure thing, but my guess is over the next 6 weeks or so, we're going to start seeing a basis pick up and a bid there, and very likely that's going to be a story. I also think it's important to point out in that story, in all of these maps we've showed, that Goldilocks rain is kind of a strategic spot. It's the minority part, but that Goldilocks good weather right there might mean they have early soybeans that could be heading to Argentina if there is a demand for that. So the reason that that's interesting is because how much of that early planted grain, because I talked to a customer, he's right about here. and he was actually done planting, right? How much of that early grain will go to Argentina to fill, export demand so that it can be crushed? How much of that will be used domestically? Here, there's quite a bit of feed for poultry, especially. How much of that will be used domestically? And then the other question is, how much will be exported to China? And that's kind of what I'm talking about is those first beans off the combine. We know Brazil's probably going to have a monster crop, but those first beans off the combine, do they go to Argentina because Argentina's already made commitments to export meal, and those first beans are just going to find a place to Argentina? Do they go to domestic demand within Brazil? Are they just crushed and then used kind of, just fill in that gap for a month or two before the regular crop gets in? Or number three, do they go straight to the export market? And the reason that could potentially make a big difference is there's still this gap between, say, December, January. Will there or will there not be demand for U.S. soybeans? We know that if you just look at the whole year, Brazil could meet the demand, but where will the beans in Brazil go? And then when will they be moved that way? So this is a story, it's a back burner story, but it is something I'm watching pretty closely. So over the weeks, we'll keep you updated. And then that kind of brings us to the final point where let's just talk about planting progress. Let's see where the crops are. So this is the CONAB report. These 12 states represent 69% of Brazil's total soybean area. And the first thing I want to point out is grab a marker here. We will get updated numbers on the 18th. Well, as of the 18th, we'll get updated numbers next Monday. Let me move this out of the way here. This is the 5-year historic average. So the first big number we want to look at is, all right, we're about almost 6 percentage points behind the historic average. So planting in Brazil is off to a little bit slower start, which makes sense. It's been drier. So it's a little too dry. They're not quite ready to get started. I also think it's important to point out that 2 of the last 5 years, we've had very fast planting, which have been the previous 2 years. So it's not bad. I haven't talked to any farmers down there that are worried about being late, but they are a little bit later. A couple of other things to point out. I'm going to do red here. These are states that are not late, but also haven't planted. So the southern tip, normal planting for them, Rio Grande do Sul, is November. And then as you go up to that northeast expansion area, it's known as the Mato Piba region. Oh, that got a little finicky. Let's see if there we go. Mato Piba region, it's just early, right? They've planted a little bit. It's just too early for them the historic average is either 0 or under 3%. So it's not a really big deal. What is worth highlighting, let me clean that up a little bit. This state of Mato Grosso right here, do this in green, that accounts for roughly 1/3 of Brazil's soybean production, and they are 10, 11 percentage points behind Mato Grosso do Sul, which is just south of there. They're, about 9 percentage points behind, 11 behind. São Paulo is about 14 percentage points behind. Then a nice little, let's get this in another color because it's a positive number. We'll do this in yellow. The state of Paraná is actually ahead of planting a little bit. And that's, if you go back to that other image I was showing you, that's that little spot there where it got good rainfall. That is western Paraná, and they are ahead of, they got timely rains. They got the crop in fast. They're okay. Just a tiny little pocket there. Southern Mato Grosso do Sul, western Paraná, and parts of Paraguay. And then, again, Santa Catarina, which is not a big producer, but they're behind. So I'm not overly concerned. Yes, soybean planting is delayed. On a national level, it's about 5 percentage points behind. The big question, though, that you can raise a great soybean crop even planting in November, but you forego your double crop corn. So the story to watch, in my opinion, is a little bit farther down the road. Will we have kind of this grain going to Argentina or being used domestically and not hitting that export market, say come January? So we'll only know that down the road, but we can start seeing symptoms of that sooner. And in a more pressing sense, will Brazil get caught up on soybean planting so they're still giving themselves a good shot at double crop corn? What are some things that could happen that could be hiccups? Like if we're trying to squint our eyes really tight and look for a bullish story, what could happen? Number one, we might not get the rains next week. And if not, then you plant it on the dry side and miss the rains, we'll be looking at replant. So that would be possibility number one. No rain. So then we're talking as early as next week. If those rains don't come, we could be talking delays of planting. This 5% could become 10% behind. And we could be talking of that, 18%, 20% that is in the ground. We could potentially be talking about some replant on that. So the rain not getting rainfall, that would be the number one story that could be bullish. That would be number one. Number two is actually the other extreme. Farmers are 5 percentage points behind. They're about 20% planted. There'll probably be more by the time we get next week's report. I think a lot of them are saying, let's go ahead and get a lot planted before those rains next week. But let's say that they don't quite get everything planted that they should, that would be sufficient to go raise a double crop. And then the rains start, and then rains don't shut off until it's the end of October. And then basically they're sitting in November and they're saying, we're going to be hard pressed to be able to raise double crop corn. So on our early beans, we can raise double crop corn, but we could potentially see reduced acreage on double crop corn if the rains turn on and then it just rains, monsoon style for 10 days, 2 weeks or something like that. And they didn't get enough planted before. So there could be a bullish story. Right now, today, I'm not overly concerned with that because I kind of think we'll be pretty close to that 30% planted mark by the time we see the report next week. And then there's rain forecasted. So if you get enough planted to plant double crop corn and then you get that Goldilocks rain, it's a lot of the battle is already won as far as double crop corn acreage and making sure you're off to a good start on soybeans. But situations change, headlines move fast. Stay tuned for next week's Friday Field Report. And if you like this video, go ahead and forward this email to other people would like it. They can go to the link there and sign up and get it for themselves. Have a great weekend and good luck next week.